Always excited to be here, always excited to spend our Saturday together, and welcome everyone to Baha'i.chat. Baha'i.chat is a conversation series dedicated to our interconnectedness. It is a moment that we can turn our thoughts to spiritual ideas, to uplift ourselves, to be in community with one another. Each weekly session is rooted in the Baha'i writings and the fundamental teachings of the Baha'i faith that really pivot around these ideas of the oneness of God, the oneness of religion, the oneness of humanity. And to do this, we call on individuals who really put these ideas into action, who really embody these principles of unity and oneness, and realize that these ideas have a spiritual grounding. Baha'u'llah, who is the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, teaches us that the oneness of mankind really is a spiritual imperative, that it is our responsibility to be engaged in our communities for the sake of the betterment of mankind. And so it's through Baha'u'llah's teachings that we understand the importance of not just our own spiritual development, but also putting these qualities into action. Also core to the Baha'i faith is the idea of the independent investigation of the truth. And this principle really means that no one's faith should be conditioned on anything other than their own understanding of and search for the truth. And so through that and through Baha'i.chat, we hope to explore truth at the deepest level, which is the level of spiritual reality. And so that's, another reason why we want to bring people on who can help us explore these ideas of truth through their own experiences, through their own perspective, with the help of the Baha'i writings and the Baha'i teachings. And so, David, I will turn it back to you to introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you for that, Anissa. Right on target. I'm delighted really to introduce a very dear friend. We go back many years. William H. Smitty Smith is the founding executive director of the National Center for Race Amity. He is the producer and co-writer of the award-winning documentary Invisible Soldiers, Unheard Voices, which aired nationally on PBS. He's also the concept creator and co-executive producer, senior writer for the 2018 documentary for public television, An American Story, Race Amity and the Other Tradition, presently airing on public television. So welcome, Smitty. Glad to have you. You are on mute. You need to, there you go.
I don't know how that muted, but we're all here together. Thank you for having me, and I'm delighted to be here and join this venture, this opportunity to share and talk with people. So thank you for inviting me.
So we're going to try this kind of in a bit of an interview format. We're trying different things as we, this is, I think, our fourth episode. Tell us, Smitty, a little bit about how you first discovered the Baha'i faith.
Well, it's a very interesting story, David, and it's actually one I like to tell because it takes me back to my childhood. When I was a kid, I grew up in South Carolina, in Greenville, South Carolina, and I went to a Baptist church. I come from a long line of Baptist preachers, etc. And my family is very much steeped in the faith, in the Baptist faith, which I attributed actually to lending me to actually discover the Baha'i faith. But as a kid, when I was a little boy, 5, 6 years old, every Sunday, we would have, not every Sunday, I'm sorry, the first Sunday of every month, we would have this white lady who would come to our church as a visitor. And each Sunday, she would stand up and say, each of those Sundays that she would come, "Hi, my name is Junie Faley. I'm a member of the Baha'i faith. We believe in the oneness of the human family, so I came to worship with you today. And later I found that she'd been going to all of the Black churches on other Sundays. But that was my first mention and hearing of Baha'i as a 5-year-old, 6-year-old kid. And it stuck with me. It's interesting because being from that Baptist tradition, I'm really into prophetic statements and the voice of the revelators of God, particularly His Holiness Christ, and of course as a Baha'i, Baha'u'llah. But long story short, Baha'u'llah in his teachings and his writings says that so powerful is the name Baha, which is glory, that if it fall on one's ears, he will have the opportunity to investigate it. And that proved true in my life because later in high school, I was reintroduced to the Baha'i faith and subsequently became a Baha'i. The attracting factor of becoming a Baha'i was that very thing that was discussed in the introduction of this chat, and that is the central principle of the Baha'i faith, the principle around which all other principles in the Baha'i faith revolve, and that is the unity and oneness of the human family. So that's my arc on becoming a Baha'i, starting when I was a little guy. And incidentally, I should say, David, it was so regular, really. My brothers and sisters and I as kids, when she'd show up, we'd say, oh man, it's White Lady Sunday. She came like clockwork every month.
Well, you know, I know and I've known for a long time that your work really revolves around the idea of race amity. And I'm wondering, you know, talk a little bit about your motivation for founding the National Center for Race Amity, which is located in Boston, Wheelock College.
Yeah, well, no longer at Wheelock. We're independent now. Wheelock was assumed. Actually, Wheelock was purchased by Boston University. And so we decided to have the center establish itself as an independent nonprofit organization. But anyway, and we are here in Boston. The motivation in founding the National Center for Race Amity, the inspiration comes from actually my belief as a Baha'i. There's many powerful statements and addresses and directives that the Baha'i writings offer to us to govern ourselves and to lead us in a way to establish unity in the human family, which is that central principle. But one of the statements in the Baha'i writing have to deal with the accomplishment of unity between the colored and white will be an assurance of the world peace. Now that's some potent stuff, and that's a very potent statement. And if you examine it, as I examine it personally, not just only knowing that the soothing salve of Baha'u'llah's teachings, telling me that I have a place at the table as a Black person, and that we're one human family. This further statement that the unity in this country of Blacks and whites will be an assurance of the world's peace. And I think, long story short, the insidious nature of slavery and the after effects of slavery and severe forms of discrimination borne out in America, that if we are able to overcome that background as a national community, that it truly will be and is inspirational to the world. Because whatever we say about our country, people look up to us. And evidence of that is you go all over the world. My experiences in traveling in Africa years ago when Mandela was being released, went to South Africa several times, and the inspiration that Black South Africans drew from our movement in civil rights and trying to establish unity. And that movement, incidentally, lest we not forget, was not a Black movement. The civil rights movement was a unified movement with the participation and sacrifice of not only the Black people who had suffered abuse and were just attacked physically and done all those things, but a tremendous sacrifice on white brothers and sisters who joined in that movement and too sacrificed and suffered the physicality, abuse, and all those things. But so the inspiration of what we do and achieve here has an impact on the world. Another quick example is the Irish movement and the liberation of Ireland. And if you go to Ireland, and I've been there many times, and one of my dear friends was a leader in that movement, they took a page and were inspired by the American Civil Rights Movement. They sing the songs. They sing "We Shall Overcome." They adore Rosa Parks and Dr. King and model their behavior on that movement and on the cross-racial alliances that were within that movement. So in a practical way, that sort of is an indication bearing out that statement that so powerful is the light of unity. And if it affects, if Blacks and whites can be unified, it can illumine the whole earth. Sort of went a little long on that answer, but, or that comment, but that's a favorite and promising statement. So I decided to work on that through an organized fashion by establishing the National Center for Race Amity 10 years ago.
Well, let me ask you, I mean, there's a lot of conversation today around, and has been around the issue of race. Racism is certainly a major problem that we face here in this country, but the term race amity, I mean, those two words aren't usually heard together. And I think the first time you hear it, it's like, oh, that's interesting. And you often talk about race amity as sort of the other tradition. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting, when we founded the center, we started, we said we wanted to be the National Center for Race Amity. And my wife's cousin, who's a public relations guy as a firm in Boston, when I was hitting the idea around, it says, Lenny, I'm going to start this center to focus on creating cross-racial friendships. And it's going to be the National Center for Race Amity. And he said, man, that's really a weird word, amity. What really does that mean, And he laughed. He says, there's the Amityville Horror, that movie was out. But at any rate, the word amity, which incidentally was, and it's not just incidentally, actually, we think it was a part of the blessing to this nation. The son of the founder of the Baha'i faith, Abdul Baha, actually visited America in 1912. And at the center of his work and his visiting this nation his priority was to address the issue of unifying, of race unity. Abdul Baha was his name, and he spoke at the National NAACP convention and gave a wonderful address there, promoting and talking about the need for the unity of the human family. He visited Howard University several times and gave addresses in integrated audiences, which was not really the norm for that day. But at any rate, this word amity, Abdul Baha talked about amity. So we examine that word, it means friends, friendship. And if you step back and look at it in terms of, in the realm of human relationships, the most powerful relationship and endearing relationship in the sociology of human beings is family. We love our families. Even those crazy people in our family, and I have some, but we love our families. Then the next order of endearment in human relationships are friends. And we love our friends, and then sometimes we love our best friends as much as family, or maybe even a little more. But so friendships and friends is really in the hierarchy of human relationships. So to the extent that we can create friendship and connect people in that way, we create bonds that really supersede all of the assaults that come to us daily in terms of society and the prejudices and all the other things that go on, because we're cemented in this close relationship. So our work, we figure, is, hey, we want to focus on creating cross-racial friendships because it has a longevity. Now, it just happens a dear friend and a mentor had done some scholarly work on this, and that's Dr. Richard Thomas. And he wrote a book in 1996, Understanding U.S. Race Relationships. And in it, he talks about and identifies this idea of the other tradition in America of cross-racial, cross-cultural friendships. I can talk more about that.
You actually last year, I think you and Dr. Thomas together wrote, didn't you write a Race Amity, a primer on America's other tradition, in fact, right?
Yeah, exactly, yes. And we did that because this is wholly a new thought, and there's a graphic. Thank you for that graphic. But this is a primer that Richard and I wrote together, co-authored, and the idea is to introduce this concept of the other tradition to people. And by example, here's the thesis, and it's a challenging thesis. And we get into some very spirited discussions with other scholars and thinkers. But here's the thesis of the other tradition, that we can look at all progress toward racial justice and equity in America, in American history, and we can look at the movements that have pushed those changes and created them. And if we examine them, we find, as a part of the core of those movements, we find close, loving, cross-racial, cross-cultural friendships. So the thesis is, throughout our history in America, we've witnessed the horrors of racism in virtually every thinking person can point to all sorts of examples of discrimination and injustices. So that history is a tradition. There's a racist tradition in America. What we don't realize and what we're trying to celebrate in our work is that there has always, since the inception of this country, and that's why we did this documentary that's presently on PBS, there has always been a parallel moral counterweight to racism. Small groups of people pushing back and ultimately being victorious in making change along the way.
Let me ask you, you often talk about sort of you call it blame, grievance, rejection cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. That's a whole discussion relative to dialogues on race and how we are not, in the end right now, being very productive because of that cycle of blame, grievance, and rejection. But I wanted to just finish for a second this comment about the other tradition and its power. That something that we need to look and know, David, is that there is, and we fail to realize this, though we mouth it every year at the King Day thing, everybody, Dr. King, the power of blah, blah. There is an exponential power in morality. Doesn't take a lot. Look at the movements that have shaped and changed this country. A minuscule percentage of Americans were engaged. But it was the exponential power of morality that had those small groups of people make change that has really shifted and continues to shift. I mean, look at, just all the movements, if you examine them. So now coming back to the blame grievance thing, one of the things that we try and offer and discuss is leading us out of this point of being, I should say, unproductive long-term in trying to have discussions around race. And it's because principally the blame, grievance, rejection. White man, David, I blame you. You white folks did it. And you know you did it. And you need to accept you did it. And I have grievances. And you need to recognize those grievances and be willing to talk to me about how we're going to remedy this. And you as a white person, you say, well, no, man, I know this stuff happened, but I didn't do it. I didn't do it. So I'm going to reject that. I feel your pain. And I say, no, you don't feel my pain. You got to take ownership of your privilege as a white man. Okay. And you're saying, well, no, I understand that exists, but I'm not going to own that. What I'm going to do is I want to work with you. And I'm saying, no, until you come to grips. And so we're now, we're locked down, brother. We're not making any progress. I'm getting annoyed that you keep saying you understand, but you won't own it. Now, as a Black man, it's very difficult for me to accept that point of view. But I had a personal and have had in life experience of how that whole thing works. Okay. I've known people where I grew up, and one friend in particular had a brother who was a really awful human being. Okay, this guy was a bully. He was always a psychopath, man. And he had a bad reputation, very bad reputation in Greenville. And his brother, younger guy who was my good friend, would go places, and I would be with his younger brother, and people would pounce on his younger brother, and me too, because I happened to be with him, and beat the crap out of him, run him away from places. And the people who attacked him would say, "You are Jesse Jones's brother, and we're gonna kick your butt because Jesse did all this stuff. Jesse did this, Jesse did that. Jesse stole this. Jesse ran over my cousin. Jesse did." And the brother, who's a wonderful guy, would say, "But I didn't do it." And the brother, my friend, George, is a wonderful person, and say, "Well, man, why am I? Why? I didn't do it. I'm a nice, you are a nice guy, George." So I'm looking at somebody wanting this guy, my best friend, to own his brother's stuff. And George is truly, to this day, one of the most wonderful human beings, not bitter, but he couldn't go around saying, "Hey man, I'm Jesse's brother and Jesse did all this, so I take ownership of it." So I sort of get it. I get that. The point is, we need to approach these relationships by establishing a friendship, a connectivity, a way that if I get to know you, I can understand you. I can be more tolerant of trying to see what your point of view is and you mine. So we think Amity is the platform, creating these relationships as a means. In fact, we created a game that I'll talk about later that deals with process of taking the factor of blame, grievance out of these dialogues.
Let me just jump ahead here because it seems like we've had a lot of hands raised. I assume that that's a lot of questions. Let me just, we're gonna open this up for questions in just a moment. So if you haven't sent one in and you'd like to, please do go ahead and do that. But I know also you had a particular quote that you wanted to talk about from the writings of Baha'u'llah. And I think we've got a graphic on that as well. Why don't we talk about that while questions are coming in, and then we'll see what folks have on their mind. Can you bring that up for us?
Yes. Well, no, it's just I'd ask, you asked me, what, Smitty, did you want to take away from this little time of talking about Race Amity and what you do? If there's one thing I could offer the listeners and participants, is this quote, which is dear to me because it's uplifting and it's a clarion call for all of us to take a look at in its simplicity, but it has tremendous spiritual power and beauty. And it's from the Baha'i writings. "O well-beloved ones, the tabernacle of unity hath been raised. Regard ye not one another as strangers. Ye are the fruits of one tree and the leaves of one branch."
Well, thank you. I'm going to turn this over to my co-host, Anissa, and I think you have got some questions coming in. What have you got? Anything for us?
Yes. So first, I want to just take a moment to thank Smitty for his insights and what he's shared with us so far. And I also want to share with everyone just our format for sharing in questions. So if you're joining us via the Zoom webinar, you can send in questions through the Q&A function. And if you're joining us on the Facebook live stream, you can send your question in as a comment on there, and we'll be checking We won't be able to get to every question probably, but we'll do our best to make sure we can answer as many as possible. And so with that, our first question is a question about some of the documentaries that you've produced, Smitty, and kind of some updates on that, and maybe what you think some of the big overarching impacts and themes have been of that work that you've done.
Well, my work centers on trying to promote and talk about the achievements of underserved and underrepresented people in American history and society and stories, and at the same time to tap into the, if you will, moral counterweight factor that is present in the stories of those people and folk. And excuse me, certainly that was one of the themes of the Invisible Soldiers, Unheard Voices, which was a documentary on African American, Latino Americans, Asian Americans who served in World War II and who were unrepresented. And one of the beautiful stories in that documentary that promoted this idea of the oneness of the human family is Senator Daniel Inouye, who received actually a Congressional Medal of Honor, who's an American who was Hawaiian actually, but of Japanese descent. In the film, he talks about when he got wounded, severely wounded, and how the blood was segregated in World War II, and how they would not give transfusions to white people of either Asian or African American blood. But in his being wounded, all the transfusions he received were from African Americans. And in the film, he says, he says, man, I have black blood in my veins, and I know that these are my brothers and that we are one. And I mean, it was just so powerful to hear this guy just say that. I mean, it's totally in a different setting, but the idea of illustrating that point. There were many other stories in that documentary that talked about the cross-racial, cross-cultural friendships that existed that involved African Americans and white folk and Latinos and Asian Americans.
We have another question that came in, viewers asking, how do we embrace the true history of white oppression over people of African descent and help white people not get defensive about that history?
Okay. How do we embrace the history?
Mm-hmm. And respond to the defensiveness that we're often met with?
Well, I'm not sure that I would use the word embrace the history. I would think of it in terms of understanding what happened and knowing that there are people who, for selfish reasons, have always put themselves above others in regard to race. And overwhelmingly, numerically, that's been practiced in this country, in America. So we have to understand that happened, but we have to at the same time understand that has not been and is not the forever sentiment and status of American society. Only a fool would say that nothing has changed in this country in the last, well, since its existence, but in the last 50 to 100 years, and it's continuing to change. And it's changing because of the power of the moral power of the other tradition, of these small groups of people pushing forth and making this change. So, we understand the truth. We say this happened, but let's move beyond it and focus on how do we use human relationships to make change, and how do we create those relationships? And everybody has a part in that. I'm sorry.
On a similar thread, another question came in about just what you were alluding to, this idea of silence towards injustice. And the question is, how can folks, or how should folks as well, take personal responsibility?
I think we all have to, the challenge to everybody across racial, cultural lines, to everyone, is to get to know someone who's different than you. Across the board. Create a relationship with someone who is different from you. And I'm talking about in the context of racial, cultural backgrounds and identities. That's a challenge for Black people, white people, brown people, everybody. That's a premise. And people can bob and weave and come up with all kinds of stuff about philosophically and what they want to see and blah, 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 blah. But be the change, and that's one of the things that we've been working on at the National Center. Be the change you want to see in race relations. And we actually have a guide that, a study guide to talk about that. But that's how we can all engage. And it's an equal level of engagement. It doesn't put it on you. It doesn't put it on that person from that group. It puts it on each one of us within our communities and who we are.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. Very important to recognize that we all have a role in this, and we all have a stake in it as well. Mm-hmm. There's a question that came in about, there's sort of this assertion that on the surface things have changed, but that there's many underlying still practices of white supremacy that haven't changed. So how do we address the things that are maybe a little bit deeper under the surface?
Well, it's through relationships. You can't you can legislate a certain degree of abuse and injustice in terms, and we've done that, on at a 40,000 foot level of the laws that we have regarding discrimination, blah, blah, blah. But when you get down to the individuals involved in the society, it has to be at that level. I don't want to go into or make a broad philosophical projection or analysis, but I will keep to a simple thought, and that thought is that people are capable of change. And even that deep down hardcore folk, it just keeps happening. You keep seeing these exceptional things happen. You say, whoa, how the hell did that happen? I mean, what did this come from? I mean, everything from, going back to Zenona Clayton befriending the Grand Dragon of the Georgia Klan back in the 60s, and this guy literally recanting the Grand Dragon of the Georgia Ku Klux Klan. Now, you would not have ever thought of that would happen. And you talk about hardcore deep down. Now, the dynamics of that were centered on friendship. Some of the worst people in our histories have transformed, and we need to keep this in mind individually, that every person, and this is in the Baha'i writings, teachings, that we were born noble and that there is nobility within us. Noble have I created thee. So even those people who are sunk now into hatred and things, they too have a nobility as human beings. And some of them can rise. And people say, oh, Smitty, you're crazy, man. You're just pie in the sky. But I'll tell you, two of my favorite heroes in life and history, or people I admire, were Malcolm X and Newton. You know, it's crazy. They changed, they were despicable in some aspects of their lives, but they transformed themselves to be just incredible human beings with the power and an insight to affect the thinking and the lives of so many others. So let's realize the possibility of transformation.
Yeah, totally. We've had a couple questions come in that are asking about solutions or steps on kind of a more intimate level, personal approaches, sort of how can
what approaches?
Like personal approaches, or how can we begin dialogues in our community? And you've touched a bit on this idea of just putting yourself in new circumstances, make a new friend who, you know, doesn't come from your same background. But I would love, in a similar vein, and kind of off of what you were saying about Malcolm X and Huey Newton, what are maybe some stories or figures we can learn about?
It was not Huey, not Huey. No. It was Amazing Grace Newton.
Oh, okay.
The slave trader, who was known through history as the most prolific trader in the cross-Atlantic slave trade. And you know, what's the song, Amazing Grace? He penned that song because in the middle of a raging storm, bringing hundreds of slaves in the bottom of his ship, and you heard them moaning and groaning, and it occurred to him, by God, these are human beings. And he said to God, literally, if you deliver me from this, I will redeem myself and I will stop this horrific trafficking in slavery. And he is one of the reasons, and I don't know why I'm blanking on his first name. I mean, you say, well, geez, one of your favorite people, you should know his first name.
Newton, but not Huey. Got it. We'll just make a note.
Okay. But that the English abolished slavery some 40 plus years before America. But John Newton, primarily because of his efforts.
Wow.
But this was one of the most, if you took a snapshot of him in history, you say he was the most despicable human being ever. I mean, known for his crafty way of stacking slaves so that he could get 4 times the cargo of other slave carriers. But then he had redemption, and he changed, and he became one of the fiercest abolitionists at that time. So that possibility exists.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm sorry.
No, thank you for clarifying that. And I think it's even so telling of how rich and varied, you know, there are so many histories and stories and people we can learn about. And so thank you for sharing that. We've had some questions come in more specifically about the National Center for Race Amity and some of the resources that you all provide. So I'd love if you can just give a quick overview for how people can tap into some of those resources that were mentioned in the chat, but additional things you guys provide, and also talking about Race Amity Day and the work that you've done with that.
Okay, a couple of things. One, I think you have a graphic, if it's possible to throw that up, that raceamity.org, www.raceamity.org, which is our site and our website that has a tremendous amount of information about the very, well, keep that, you could leave that one for a second.
Yeah.
This guide, Be the Change that we seek in race relations. This is an important study guide. It's accessible for folk, except you send info at Race Amity. If anyone sends an email to info@raceamity.org, we will send, the center will respond. Okay, there's an info@raceamity.org.
Let me get I can bring up the email address for you guys.
So info@raceamity.org. For anyone who would like to get electronically, we'll send you Be the Change you want to see in race relations. Now, just coming back quickly, that this study guide is based on a development from the National Spiritual Assembly of Baha'is of the United States. As we've said over and over, and listeners know, the dedication and focus of Baha'i is the unity of the human family. And so our national organization, administration, of course, promotes that thought as well. And one of the ways is that they issued a statement some years ago on the power of race unity, race unity, America's most challenging issue. And it points to all of the things that we need to address relative to this most challenging issue in the nation. So we built this discussion guide around some of those observations. And this is free. This is not any cost thing. If people go to, just send an email to info@raceamity.org. Relative to Race Amity Day, and the thing is, we missed earlier sort of going through the litany of activities that we're engaged in, but one ongoing one is that having Race Amity Day observed the second Sunday in June nationwide. And our work right now centers on establishing Race Amity Day as a national day of recognition. We had it recognized by the U.S. Senate 2 years ago through a resolution, but we want to permanently make the second Sunday in June as an official day in the U.S. 2 states have actually done it. One, people might be able to put yes quickly, which is Massachusetts. It's an official day on the state calendar, passed by the legislature, second Sunday in June. And the act establishing the day has the governor annually sending notifications to all cities and towns, 351 of them, urging them to hold appropriate activities in observance of Race Amity. The second state to do, they've done it for 1 year, and we're trying to get it permanent in that state, is South Carolina. South Carolina established through the state assembly last year, the second Sunday in June is Race Amity Day in South Carolina, and we're hoping to make it permanent. We're working this year to do it, to have it done in 4 other states. And at the same time, we're working to get this national resolution passed. So anyone interested can go. Again, they can go to raceamity.org, or they can send an email to info@raceamity, and our office will send connections to links with information, materials that are free that people can download from our website.
Are there any plans or considerations that have been made for this year's celebration, given the kind of confinements that we're in right now?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Various towns, here in the town that I live in, the Sudbury Race Amity Day Committee, in fact, they're meeting at 4 o'clock to talk about what kinds of things should be done. One of the suggestions that's come from, actually came from 2 different towns, is that we do a short program of about 30 minutes on the through like a webinar with a presentation. This would be for national consumption on Race Amity Day, and getting a speaker to do that so that it can be shared nationally. And then at the end of that presentation, have every town and community create their own activities to engage and talk about Race Amity. And one of them can be having dialogues. There's so many levels. So we're doing that, which gives me an opportunity to mention that this year will be the 10th year of the revival of the National Race Amity Conference. And this year the conference will be virtual. We will be sending specific information on June 1 on the conference. It's held every year the Thursday before Thanksgiving. So this year it will be the 19th through the 21st, I believe, and it will be a virtual conference. But we're billing it as our 10th anniversary virtual conference, leading to the centenary in 2021, centenary celebration of the first National Race Amity Conference held in America in 1921.
Amazing, wonderful. Well, we're coming up on 1 hour. So I want to thank you, Smitty, and thank all of our wonderful attendees and the team at Baha'i Chat for another great Saturday spent together.